The air inside the Long Beach Arena on March 20th, 1969, didn't just smell like floor wax and old canvas, it smelled like certain victory. If you were a martial artist in the late 60s, this was your mecca. This was the International Karate Championships, the Olympics of the striking world. But despite the thousands of square feet of mats and the hundreds of black belts roaming the floor, the entire building seemed to revolve around one man. To the 500 spectators in the stands, Michael the Destroyer Chen wasn't just a competitor, he was a force of nature. He was a 215-pound wall of muscle, standing over 6 feet tall, draped in a heavy white gi that snapped like a whip every time he moved. Michael had spent 22 years, nearly his entire life, polishing a version of karate that was, by all accounts, perfect. He was a 4th-degree black belt in Shotokan, a style built on deep, powerful stances and linear strikes designed to end a fight in a single blow. And for Michael, it worked. He had 47 consecutive wins under his belt. He hadn't felt the sting of a loss in over half a decade. When Michael moved, it was like watching a well-oiled machine. His punches were textbook. His kicks were thunderous. He was the golden boy of the American karate scene, the man who had turned his back on his traditional Chinese roots to embrace a more marketable, more aggressive image. He had even changed his name to sound more like a Hollywood star, a move that reflected his growing ego. To Michael, the world was simple. There was Japanese karate, which was the pinnacle of human combat, and then there was everything else, the junk that didn't belong on his stage. The atmosphere that Saturday afternoon was thick with a specific kind of tribalism. In 1969, the martial arts world was fractured into silos. If you practiced Shotokan, you didn't talk to the Goju Ryu guys. If you did Taekwondo, you looked down on the Kung Fu stylists. It was a world of rigid rules, stiff uniforms, and ancient traditions that no one dared to question. And as the heavyweight finals approached, Michael Chen felt like the high priest of this temple. He wasn't just there to win a trophy, he was there to defend an empire of glass. A system that looked beautiful and felt strong, but had never been tested by someone who refused to play by the rules. As Michael warmed up center stage, the crowd sat in a trance. You could hear the thwack of his fist hitting the air from the back row. He was performative, loud, and intentionally intimidating. He looked like the ultimate warrior. But hidden away in row 14, tucked between a few curious students, sat a man who looked like he had lost his way to a library. This man didn't have a 200-pound frame. He wasn't wearing a pristine white uniform with a black belt that signified years of kata. He was small, barely 140 pounds, dressed in casual street clothes that made him blend into the background. He sat with his arms crossed, watching Michael's perfect movements, with a look that wasn't exactly impressed. It was more like a scientist observing a flawed experiment. Out of the 500 people in that building, only 12 people knew who that man was. To the other 488, he was just a spectator, a nobody in a room full of somebodies. The judges ignored him. The tournament organizers didn't give him a second glance. Michael, who prided himself on his awareness, looked right past him. They saw a small Chinese man. They didn't see the hurricane that was about to hit them. Michael's dominance had created a blind spot. When you win 47 times in a row, you start to believe that your way is the only way. You start to think that the rules of your sport are the rules of reality. Michael believed that because he was the king of the tournament, he was the king of the street. He believed that his deep stances and rigid blocks were the ultimate answer to any question a fight could ask. He was a man standing at the top of a mountain, looking down on everyone else, unaware that the mountain was made of sand. As the clock ticked toward 3:45 p.m., the tournament organizer handed Michael the microphone. Usually, this was a moment for a champion to give a polite speech about respect and discipline. But Michael was feeling untouchable. He looked out at the crowd, his chest puffed out, the lights reflecting off his sweat-slicked brow, and decided that being the champion wasn't enough. He wanted to be a judge. He wanted to be the one who decided what was real and what was fake. He began to speak, and his voice boomed through the speakers, dripping with a confidence that felt more like a threat. He spoke about the superiority of the Japanese system. He spoke about the weakness of other styles. And then He turned his sights toward a target that had been bothering him for a long time. The flashy, flowery world of Kung Fu. At that time, Kung Fu was seen by the karate elite as nothing more than a dance. It was the stuff of cheap cinema and unrealistic movements. Michael called it out by name. He mocked the fluidity. He laughed at the lack of power. He challenged anyone in the building who practiced those dances to come up and prove him wrong. He was so sure of his own strength, so wrapped up in the destroyer persona, that he didn't realize he was baiting a trap for himself. In row 14, the small man shifted. The 12 people who knew him held their breath. They knew something the rest of the arena didn't. Michael Chen had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He wasn't just challenging a style, he was challenging a philosophy that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The arena went silent. It was that heavy, awkward silence that happens right before a car crash. Michael stood there, smiling, waiting for a challenge he was certain would never come. He thought he had silenced the room with his greatness. He didn't know he had just invited the future of martial arts to walk down those stairs and dismantle everything he believed in. The glass empire was about to shatter, and it wouldn't be because of a bigger, stronger karateka. It would be because of a man who didn't care about belts, didn't care about traditions, and most importantly, didn't care about Michael's 47-0 record. The stage was set, the ego was primed, and the world was about to learn that a champion is only a champion until they meet a master. 2. The unseen storm. A stranger in row 14 challenges the king. The silence in the Long Beach arena wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. Michael the Destroyer Chen stood center stage, the microphone still clutched in his hand, a smug grin playing on his lips. He had just thrown down the gauntlet, effectively calling every Chinese martial artist in the building a dancer rather than a fighter. He scanned the rows of seats, his eyes skipping over the common spectators, looking for a fellow black belt to challenge him. He expected no one to move. In the rigid, status-heavy world of 1969 karate, you didn't challenge a Triple Crown champion unless you had the rank to back it up. Then, a voice broke the stillness. It wasn't a scream or a theatrical shout. It was a calm, melodic tone that somehow sliced through the ambient hum of the air conditioners and the muffled whispers of the crowd. I'll accept your challenge. The heads of 500 people snapped toward row 14. Michael squinted, his hand shielding his eyes from the harsh overhead spotlights. Emerging from the shadows was a man who looked like he had just finished a casual lunch. No GI. No calloused knuckles on display. Just a lean, compact frame dressed in a simple black shirt and trousers. As Bruce Lee stepped into the aisle, the visual contrast was almost comical. Michael Chen was a mountain of a man, a 215-pound heavyweight who looked like he was carved out of granite. Bruce, by comparison, looked like a light breeze could knock him over. He stood 5 feet 7 inches and weighed barely 140 pounds. It was the classic image of David walking toward Goliath, but in this version, David didn't even have a sling. He just had a look of quiet, focused intensity that made the 12 people who recognized him lean forward in their seats. Dan Inosanto, sitting right next to Bruce's empty seat, felt a surge of adrenaline. He had whispered to Bruce to let it go, to ignore the arrogance of the man on stage. But Bruce wasn't just defending his own honor, he was defending the soul of martial arts. He wasn't interested in points or trophies, he was interested in the truth. As Bruce made his way down the stairs, the atmosphere in the arena shifted from confusion to a strange, electric curiosity. The karate kids and the veteran masters watched this nobody with a mix of pity and amusement. They saw a small man in street clothes and assumed he was either incredibly brave or incredibly delusional. Michael, seeing the size of his challenger, let out a short, barking laugh. "You do kung fu?" Michael asked, his voice dripping with condescension as Bruce reached the edge of the stage. "I practice Chinese martial arts." "Yes," Bruce replied, his voice steady as he climbed the steps. He didn't rush. He didn't try to look tough. He moved with a feline grace that suggested every muscle in his body was perfectly tuned, even if they weren't bulging like Michael's. The tournament organizer, Ed Parker, a man who actually knew exactly who Bruce was and what he was capable of, stepped forward. Parker was a visionary who saw the potential for a clash of styles. He grabbed a second microphone. "Gentlemen," Parker announced, his voice echoing, "this will be a demonstration. No official judging. We will keep it to light contact. We are here to see the application of style, not to draw blood." Michael shrugged, his ego now fully in the driver's seat. "Fine by me. I'll go easy on the actor." The word actor hung in the air like an insult. Michael had recognized Bruce from the Green Hornet TV show, but to a real fighter like Michael, being on television was proof that you couldn't fight. In his mind, movie fighting was all about camera angles and pulled punches. He saw Bruce as a performer playing dress-up in a world of warriors. He figured he would throw a few heavy punches, show the crowd how real karate dominates fake kung fu, and send the little man back to Hollywood with a bruised ego. They met in the center of the mat. Michael immediately dropped into a deep, rock-solid Shotokan front stance. His lead hand was extended, his rear hand chambered at his hip, his feet planted like tree roots. It was a beautiful, terrifying display of traditional power. He looked like an impenetrable fortress. Bruce, however, did something that baffled the audience. He didn't set himself. He didn't drop into a deep stance or mimic Michael's rigid posture. He stood naturally, his feet about shoulder width apart, his hands up but relaxed. He was bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet, his weight shifting almost imperceptibly. To the karate-trained eye, he looked completely open, completely unprotected. "Ready?" Michael asked, a predatory glint in his eye. Bruce didn't say a word. He simply nodded, his eyes locked onto Michael's chest, not his face, a sign of a fighter who was looking at the center of gravity, not the distractions of the eyes. The air in the arena felt like it was under high pressure. The judges stood back. The spectators held their breath, and the 47-0 champion prepared to end the movie star's night in seconds. Michael saw a small target. He saw a man who wasn't even wearing a belt. He saw an easy victory that would solidify his legacy forever. What he didn't see was the storm that had been brewing in row 14. He didn't see the years of obsessive training, the revolutionary philosophy, or the terrifying speed that Bruce Lee was about to unleash. Michael thought he was about to give a lesson. He had no idea he was about to become the most famous victim in martial arts history. The judge's hand dropped. "Begin!" In that split second, the world changed. The destroyer lunged forward, confident that his first punch would end the debate. But as his fist cut through the air, he realized with a jolt of pure panic that there was nothing there to hit. The small man in the black shirt had vanished from the spot, and for the first time in 5 years, Michael Chen felt a cold shiver of doubt. The hunt was over. The lesson had begun. 8 minutes of reality. When movie magic became a masterclass. The moment the signal was given, Michael Chen did what he had done 47 times before. He attacked. He launched a lunging punch, a classic Oizuki, backed by every pound of his heavyweight frame. It was a strike that had ended matches in seconds. But as his fist reached the target, it met nothing but empty air. Bruce hadn't jumped back or panicked. He had simply melted to the side, a movement so subtle and efficient, it looked like Michael had just aimed poorly. The champion reset, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face, and fired a snap kick aimed at Bruce's ribs. Again, Bruce wasn't there. He moved like a shadow, staying just an inch outside the danger zone, his eyes calm, his hands still relaxed. To the audience, it was confusing. They were used to the clash of karate, the sound of forearm hitting forearm, the struggle for dominance, but this wasn't a clash. It was a ghost hunt. Michael began to increase his speed, throwing combinations that had won him 3 consecutive titles. He was a whirlwind of white fabric and leather-tough skin. Yet, no matter how fast he lunged, Bruce stayed exactly 1 step ahead. It was as if Bruce was reading Michael's mind, reacting to the muscle twitch in the champion's shoulder before the punch was even thrown. Frustration is a poison for a fighter, and Michael was drinking it by the gallon. His destroyer persona was beginning to crack. He decided to abandon the light contact agreement. He wanted to feel bone on bone. He wanted to prove that his power was real. He gathered his strength and launched a massive roundhouse kick, aiming to take Bruce's head off. This time, Bruce didn't move away. He moved in. Before Michael's leg could reach its full, bone-shattering extension, Bruce stepped into the eye of the hurricane. He closed the distance so fast the audience gasped. Using a Wing Chun technique that looked more like a surgical strike than a punch, Bruce's lead hand shot out. Thwack. It wasn't a full power blow. It was a check. His fist stopped less than an inch from Michael's nose. The air from the punch was enough to make the champion blink. Bruce's other hand was simultaneously pinning Michael's shoulder, leaving the destroyer completely tangled in his own momentum. For a heartbeat, they were frozen. The message was deafening. I could have ended this. Bruce stepped back, resetting into that loose, bounce-like stance. Michael was breathing hard now, not just from exertion, but from the realization that his entire world was being dismantled. He tried to go back to his basics, throwing a series of straight punches. Bruce began to trap his hands. The movie actor was putting on a clinic. Bruce began to showcase the straight blast, a flurry of vertical punches aimed directly down Michael's centerline. Michael tried to block, but the punches were coming too fast, from angles his traditional karate training hadn't prepared him for. Bruce was moving in straight lines while Michael was trying to move in circles. Bruce was staying relaxed while Michael was stiff with tension. By the 6-minute mark, the arrogance had completely drained from the arena. The judges were leaning forward, their mouths open. The karate students in the front rows were dead silent. They weren't watching a demonstration anymore. They were watching the birth of a new era. Bruce was proving that a smaller, faster, and more fluid fighter could utterly dominate a larger, stronger opponent by refusing to fight on the opponent's terms. In the final minute, Michael made one last desperate attempt. He threw a heavy, committed reverse punch. Bruce slipped the punch, grabbed Michael's extended arm, and in one fluid motion, swept the champion's lead leg while placing a palm against his chest. Michael, the Destroyer, Chen, the 215-pound undefeated king of American karate, hit the mat with a thud that echoed to the rafters. Bruce didn't follow him down. He didn't gloat. He simply stood over him, his hands in a low guard, his breathing as steady as if he'd just taken a light stroll. He waited for Michael to scramble back to his feet. When the champion finally stood, his face was red, his hair was a mess, and his pristine white GI was stained with the dust of the mat. The 8 minutes were up. The movie star hadn't just survived. He had conducted a masterclass. He had turned the biggest stage in martial arts into a laboratory, and the result of his experiment was undeniable. The old ways were no longer enough. The audience didn't cheer immediately. They were too busy trying to process the fact that they had just seen the impossible happen right before their eyes. The king had been dethroned, not by a better karateka, but by a man who had transcended style itself. 4. The philosophy of water, breaking the chains of tradition. The fight was over, but the atmosphere in the Long Beach arena was far from settled. A thick, vibrating energy hummed through the crowd. Michael stood on the mats, heaving for air, looking like a man who had just seen a ghost. The audience was waiting for the theatrics to end, for someone to explain how a 140-pound man had just systematically dismantled a giant. Ed Parker, sensing that this was a pivotal moment in history, didn't call for the next match. Instead, he kept the microphones live. He knew that the 500 people in those stands weren't just curious, they were shaken. Their entire belief system, built on years of rigid stances and one-hit-kill karate logic, had just been proven incomplete. Bruce Lee didn't walk off the stage. He didn't take a bow and disappear. Instead, he began to speak. And for the next 15 minutes, he gave what many now consider the most important lecture in the history of combat sports. Your techniques, Bruce said, looking at Michael but addressing the entire room, are beautiful. Your form is perfect, but you are fighting like you are reading a book in a language that doesn't exist anymore. He began to demonstrate the concepts he had just used to humiliate the champion. He spoke about economy of motion. He showed how a traditional karate practitioner chambers their punch, pulling the hand back to the hip before firing. To the audience, it looked powerful. To Bruce, it was a telegraph. When you chamber, you are sending a letter to your opponent, Bruce explained, his hands moving with rhythmic, mesmerizing speed. You are saying, look out, here comes my fist. By the time your letter arrives, I have already moved. My punch starts from where my hand is. No preparation, no warning. He called for a volunteer from the front row, a young, sturdy black belt. Bruce asked the man to hold a heavy leather shield. Without any visible wind-up, Bruce's fist exploded forward from just inches away. The famous 1-inch punch. The volunteer was sent flying backward, stumbling over several feet of mat before crashing into the judges' table. The sound wasn't a thud, it was a crack, like a whip breaking the sound barrier. The room gasped. This wasn't movie magic. This was physics applied with terrifying precision. Bruce then dove into the heart of his philosophy. This was the core of what he called Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. He began to tear down the walls of the styles that everyone in that room held sacred. He told them that being a Shotokan man, or a Wing Chun man, was a cage. He argued that styles were nothing more than organized despair, a way of limiting a human being's natural ability to adapt. If you are a karate man, you only know how to answer a question with a karate punch, Bruce said, pacing the stage like a panther. But a fight is a living thing. It is always changing. If you are rigid, you break. If you are water, you flow. This was where he uttered the words that would eventually define his legacy. He told the audience that they must be formless, shapeless, like water. He explained that if you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. If you put it into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can flow, or it can crash. Be water, my friend, he whispered into the microphone, the words carrying an almost spiritual weight. The masters in the front row looked uncomfortable. Bruce was essentially telling them that their secret katas and their ancient traditions were holding them back. He was saying that the belt around their waist didn't mean they knew how to fight. It just meant they knew how to follow rules. He challenged the very idea of classical martial arts, calling them organized rituals that had nothing to do with the chaotic reality of a street fight. He demonstrated chisao, or sticking hands, with Dan Inosanto. The two of them moved in a blur of tactile sensitivity, their arms entwined, feeling each other's pressure and exploiting gaps in defense without even looking. It looked less like a fight and more like a conversation. It was sensitivity training that made the hard blocks of karate look primitive and clunky. By the time Bruce finished his impromptu seminar, the 12 people who knew him were no longer the only ones in awe. The entire arena had been converted. Even the skeptics, the ones who were angry that their traditions were being mocked, couldn't deny what they had seen with their own eyes. Bruce Lee hadn't just beaten a champion, he had provided a blueprint for the future. He wasn't just showing them how to punch faster, he was showing them how to think differently. He was preaching a message of individual freedom over institutional dogma. Research your own experience, he told them. Absorb what is useful, discard what is useless, and add what is specifically your own. As he stepped back to return to his seat in row 14, the silence finally broke. It started as a small ripple of applause and turned into a standing ovation that shook the rafters of the Long Beach Arena. The movie actor had just finished his greatest performance, but it wasn't for a camera. It was for the truth. And in those 15 minutes, the martial arts world in America didn't just grow, it evolved. 5. The aftermath. From defeat to enlightenment. As the lights dimmed in the Long Beach Arena and the crowd began to filter out into the cool California evening, the world outside looked exactly the same. But for those who had been inside, the landscape of martial arts had shifted permanently. The International Karate Championships would continue to exist, but the shadow cast by those 8 minutes would loom over every tournament for decades to come. In the parking lot, away from the eyes of the judges and the lingering fans, a different kind of drama was unfolding. Michael the Destroyer. Chen sat on the bumper of his car, his head in his hands. The weight of his first loss in 5 years was heavy, but it wasn't the loss itself that stung. It was the way it had happened. He had been a king in his own mind, protected by a fortress of titles and trophies, only to realize that the fortress was made of paper. Footsteps echoed across the asphalt. Michael looked up to see Bruce Lee walking toward his own vehicle, flanked by Dan Inosanto. The champion stood up, his body stiff from the encounter, his ego still raw. A few hours ago, he would have ignored this man or offered a condescending remark. Now, he did the only thing a true martial artist could do when faced with a superior truth. "Mr. Lee?" Michael called out, his voice cracking slightly. Bruce stopped and turned. There was no mockery in his expression. No, I told you so, glint in his eyes. He looked at Michael with the same calm intensity he had shown on the mat. I've spent my whole life being the best at what I do, Michael said, gesturing back toward the arena. But today, I realized that I don't actually know how to fight. I only know how to win matches. I want to learn what you have. I want to know how to be water. Bruce studied him for a long moment. He saw the sincerity in the man's eyes. He saw that the destroyer had been destroyed, and in his place was a student. My time is limited, Bruce said quietly. I have films, I have my own training, and I have a family. I don't take many students. I'll do whatever it takes, Michael insisted. I'll start from the beginning. I'll unlearn everything. Bruce nodded slowly. Come to my school in Los Angeles, Saturday mornings. We will see if you are truly ready to empty your cup. For the next 2 years, the man who had been the undisputed king of American karate became a nobody again. Michael Chen showed up every Saturday. He traded his heavy, prestigious black belt for simple sweatpants. He allowed Bruce to dismantle his footwork, his punching mechanics, and his mindset. He learned that the power he had spent 20 years developing was useless if it couldn't find a target. He learned that the perfect kata was a prison for his reflexes. Michael didn't stop competing, but he changed. When he returned to the tournament circuit in 1970 and 1971, he was unrecognizable. He was still a heavyweight, but he moved with the fluidity of a middleweight. He stopped clashing with his opponents and started flowing through them. He remained a champion, but he was no longer a karate man. He was a martial artist in the truest sense, a man who had integrated the best of his roots with the revolutionary concepts of Jeet Kune Do. The impact of March 20th, 1969, radiated far beyond just one man. The 12 people who knew Bruce Lee that day told 12 more, and word of the Long Beach lesson spread like wildfire through the global community. It was the catalyst that began to break down the walls between different styles. People started looking at their own traditions with a critical eye. They began to ask, does this work because it's tradition, or does it work because it's effective?